Okay, so there's an episode about autism and intuition. So, to help maybe make sense of it, we're going to map this out a little bit so we can understand all the brain regions, because there's a lot of brain regions that we discuss. Luckily, though, if you follow the podcast, these brain regions aren't new. The OFC here is somewhat not discussed that much, but we're going to talk about more of it. And then we can also filter in some bodily responses because we're talking about intuition. A lot of people think of it as like this gut instinct, partial of it. But intuition is prediction under uncertainty. Uncertainty. Prediction under uncertainty. That's what intuition is doing functionally for the living organism. Okay? And for people with autism versus the so-called typicals, in the podcast episode, I'll use neurotypical sometimes, reluctantly kind of, but the autistic phenotype processes this information a little bit differently. And we'll kind of make sense of the details, the amount of details that's known with the autistic phenotype. Okay? So with intuition, it's a big loop here. Now, I have this laid out kind of linear or in a layer, but this is a loop. And we have sensory information, so highlighted as visual cortex 1, auditory cortex, and the somatosensory cortex. Remember the episode about serotonin. Serotonin is mapping all of this out from the thalamus, because the thalamus is a workhorse for sensations and the thalamocortical loops. The thalamus is constantly updating and sending out information across the whole brain. It's a workhorse. So the sensory information are in green. We're going to go through this little diagram here, this color-coded diagram. Okay, and then the parietal lobe. This is where sensation is kind of integrated, where sensations are making meaning. And that will lead to, okay, so where's the spotlight of attention going? What is happening? Where does this sensory information coming in? And what do I need now? We're talking about sensory processing, sensations to perceptions. It's what everything about human life is, essentially. And then we're having several brain regions here for things like emotions and feelings, meaning, value, your priors, what happened before, what happened the last time, and expectation. Remember, the brain is a prediction machine. And then decision making. A lot of internal calculations going on here. So we have some pretty intense hubs here, or brain regions, that we'll talk about a little bit. And then learning. A key factor of what we're talking about here is learning. And we're going to talk more about iterative learning and how the autistic phenotype has an ability for accelerated learning and so forth. So the basal ganglia, we've talked about the basal ganglia a lot. And so the basal ganglia is here in red. And then the substantia nigra pars compacta down here in the mesencephalon. Okay, so we have green, the sensory. The orange is the parietal. Pink, it's almost like the red. I don't know if you can discriminate pink and red on the video, but it's the amygdala. The amygdala is a bit of a misnomer. People think it's just fear. We're way past the era and the age of this brain region is responsible for this thing. And the amygdala equals fear is a big misnomer. The amygdala is associated with a lot of emotion and motivation. It attaches emotion to different things, positive and negative. But fear is a very powerful thing. And then I lost where I was. And then the purple, the OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, and the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. In purple, here It's right here on the eyebrows. And then the dorsolateral, it's out, up through here. And then the ACC and insula. ACC, the anterior cingulate cortex, and the insula. Remember though, the insula is very lateral. It's almost like it evolved later in the history of living organisms. But the ACC is medial. It's part of the medial prefrontal cortex. It's deep inside by the midline. These are very functional and powerful little regions. We're going to talk a lot about those. We've talked a lot about those. We have several episodes about those. And then the basal ganglia, that's in red there. Okay, so sensory cortex, what this is doing in autism and intuition, or intuition in general, is for neurotypicals, intuition is compressed. It's kind of averaged out. It's just a gist of things. And it's in large part based off of social models, social inputs. What is happening in the outside world? How does this fit the social context? Okay. Autism, there's a higher signal fidelity and there's less averaging. The autistic phenotype needs details and it needs truth. And it's a very powerful thing, actually, with the autistic phenotype. Higher signal fidelity is preservation of details in sensory information across cortical layers. You can go with the layers of the cortex, remember the 6 layers, or just across these brain regions. Either way. And this is dictated by the EI imbalance. Excitation, inhibition. This is a key function of the autistic phenotype. Remember the seesaw, high excitation and low inhibition. Remember those areas that we've talked about here. Remember the parietal lobe and the ACC and the insula and the thalamus with the thalamic reticular nucleus. In the episode about autism and intuition, we'll go into this with the parvalbium interneuron because it's in large part in play here. So this imbalance is kind of help sending more detail through. And the so-called neurotypical brain will filter that out. Those details don't make it versus autistics, okay? Neurotypical brains filter that and then provide a prediction error fast. And they have alpha gating and inhibition that's just eliminating the details and just providing that just making a basic concept, a basic model of what is happening in society, what is happening in their environment. Okay, in autism, that compression is not in there. There is a lot more detail and a lot more timing shifts because of this fast rate of information coming in. And this is, it's very powerful. And this is what, in large part, makes the outside world chaotic because of that fast rate of information coming in through the sensory and this sensory integration areas. So all of these sensory cortices, and then the parietal lobe is being blasted. Remember the visual thinking episode. There's a little region in the parietal lobe. A shadow's getting in the way. The parietal lobe called the precuneus. The precuneus is involved with the so-called default mode network, and it's involved in visual thinking. And the visual cortex and the precuneus is getting blasted with visual inputs, both in gamma and the amount of information coming in. Makes it hard to shift, makes it hard to scan, makes it hard to send that information onward. Okay, so the parietal lobe this is where social cues will be powerful for those that's processing social information, like not the autistic. Okay, for the autistic phenotype, there are a lot of anomalies that are picked out, easily seen, like what is happening here, type of thing. The parietal cortex decides what matters now. Where am I going to send my spotlight of information, my spotlight of attention? And this is salience, okay? This is based towards faces or gaze or tone, different social motivational factors for the neurotypical. That's not the case for autism. You probably know that. You probably get that understanding of that part. Okay? Autistic and salience is biased toward what doesn't fit right here. What is happening? What is these errors and gaps and inconsistencies? Remember the kind of the black and white or rigid thinking that you might label that as. But we'll see. I mean, okay, who's right? Who's right with that? Reality gets weighted more differently. Reality matters more for the autistic phenotype. And that is a big thing, okay? Reality gets weighted more heavily than the social narrative. It's not that complicated. And then the insula is heavily involved next, okay? Remember, it's here. The insula is it's a major hub of the salience network, okay? We're making sense of the salience network now. You can see why this is involved with the salience network is frequently discussed, okay? Neurotypicals will kind of get a gut feeling here and then just go off of this generalization. And that's not the case for the autistic phenotype, okay? Remember the thing about the insula that is very fascinating is it's privileged to different brain states, what is happening in the brain, what is happening in the body, and what is happening in the environment, okay? So a big part of inputs coming in to the insula is heart rate variability, okay? Your heart rate, does it match the environment? Does it match the situation? Breathing, both the rate and depth of breath, and then gut feelings. Okay, that's my loose diagram drawing of the gut. So these bodily feelings, these are very finite. There's not a whole lot of information coming from the body. I mean, it's just basically these three things. And then it will send information up to the spine, the brainstem, and it will hit the insula pretty quick. So this is a big input. This is weighted heavily for people. Neurotypical intuition and that uncertainty turns into that gut feeling. Okay, what is happening? The autistic phenotype, interoception, is often noisy or delayed here. Okay, because there's a lot of region of interest with the brainstem and crossing over body to brain, and especially this somatosensory. Remember, we drew that out with the homunculus. So it's hard to map. It's hard for precision detail of body and brain to make sense of things in the autistic phenotype because of that kind of disconnection. So instead of intuition being a feeling, it arrives more as just kind of piecing out detail and that anomaly of that doesn't make sense, that's not right, type of thing. The OFC, the orbital frontal cortex, which is here, is very fascinating because there's a lot of value here. For the so-called neurotypical, there's a lot of social reward, social integration, and social motivation happening here, okay? This is, they want that harmony. They want to be able to fit in. They want that social affirmation. People like that. Autistics don't really care. So the autistic phenotypes, orbital frontal cortex, is more for coherence. Does the truth make sense now? And whenever it makes sense, the downstream signals from the orbital frontal cortex will smooth better. It just comes in line and is coherent. what's fascinating about the OFC is it receives information, sensory information fast, not raw information, but it receives projections from things like the parietal and the frontal eye fields and everything that's processing sensation. It receives it pretty fast, okay? There's a lot of evolutionary explanations for that. So, for many people, value is shaped by that social harmony, whereas in autism, valuation shifts towards the consistency of things. And then also involved is the ACC, anterior cingulate cortex. The cingulate is very fascinating. Remember, it wraps around white matter tracks. So we talk a lot about the ACC. And this is where conflict is happening, conflict monitoring. You can see the whiteboard episode about the spindle neurons, and we outline the roles in detail of the ACC and the insula, because I really want to highlight that the spindle neurons, remember, spindle neurons like that versus just basic like pyramidal neurons. The spindle neurons are big, they're larger, they're extremely large, and they're very fast, they're rapid for fast transmission about what is happening in the environment. So they're not only longer, but they're bipolar. They don't have very many connections. They're often found in like layers 5 and 6. So they receive the information from layer 2 and 3, and then they're able to send it down to the white matter tracks just below layer 6 in the mini columns. Okay, so these are found heavily in the ACC, the insula, and then there's a little bit of clusters in humans in the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex. There's like in clusters of 2 or 3. They're more populated or dense in the ACC and insula. Still not very dense though. And remember, the spindle neurons are only found in like 10 different species, like apes and chimps and bonobos, elephants and cetaceans, things like whales and dolphins. Very primitive and social creatures these are found in. Okay, so this is a big thing with intuition, because these are larger for fast, rapid transmission. Okay, so back to the ACC and insula. Remember, we have the parvalbuum interneuron. They're heavily involved here, and there's a lack of parvalbuum interneuron in the ACC and insula, and that thalamic reticular nucleus. Okay, so one thing the ACC is doing, one is a huge internal calculator. It provides a lot of weight towards our internal calculations, because remember, everything happening right now is a prediction machine. The brain is a prediction machine. It conserves energy by predicting. Remember, the brain does not want to respond, or the brain does not want to work. It just wants to respond. It does not want to work. It just wants to respond. Okay, so the ACC doesn't just detect errors, it evaluates them. Is effort worth it? Okay, is what I'm doing worth it? And what is the reward of my effort is a big thing here. Conflict monitoring, error detection type thing. Okay, in the autistic phenotype, the ACC stays online until structural coherence is achieved. Okay, there's no generalization of things. It's, does this make sense or not? And time on task will persist for the autistic phenotype until something makes sense, something until reality matches. And whenever I say it makes sense, I'm not talking about, is it making sense just enough to move on? Is it just? Is it generalized? Can we manipulate it and fit it into our box to just make it feel, okay, that's acceptable. Okay, time to move on. The autistic phenotype is not like that. Okay, So there's not a lot of acceptance there as far as being close enough. And then iterative learning is a big thing here with, the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex and the basal ganglia. Remember, lots of episodes about the basal ganglia. So the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex is a lot of modeling. One of the tools of the brain is running models of the world, running models of what I might do. The idea of thoughts are to allow our thoughts to die and not us. We're running models. We're making predictions of the world. If I do this in this type of situation, what might happen? Thoughts are powerful for humans. But the idea of those thoughts are so we can let them play out and die. So we don't have to go figure it out on our own and just find out. We can run models. So this thing right here is also doing some cause and effect, and working memory is big here. And then the basal ganglia, it's consolidating successful predictions. So it's getting inputs from sensory motor, dorsolateral, the ACC, and so forth. Remember the dorsal striatum? And whenever things are determined to be acceptable, so for the neurotypical, it's just close enough. So we'll close that loop and we'll stamp that with the basal ganglia. And then our behaviors will be ran through that. There's a lot of learning in the basal ganglia, especially with actions. Okay. One thing about the ACC is action selection. Okay, because there's a lot of inputs coming into the dorsal striatum from the ACC and the sensory motor. Okay. So from the outside, it looks like instinct, but internally, it's a lot of repetition and refinement, not the diffusion refinement that we drew out in the mini columns. I'm talking about sticking on task and perfecting something. That's what refinement is meaning here, perfecting something. And then once it's perfected, once it's learned, it closes this loop. The thing about autism is this loop will stay open, and that's why the autistic phenotype can persist. That's why the autistic phenotype can stay on task, time on a specific task. 3. B3 of the DSM-5 and DSM-5-TR. Restricted fixated interest that are abnormal in intensity or focus. This is a huge part of learning. This is why the autistic phenotype can stay on task and learn. And with great detail to information. This is all happening here, and it's flooded in for the autistic phenotype because of the sensory processing. And all this information is coming through, and it's being ran through this loop until it's figured out. And the autistic phenotype can persist until however long it needs. Now, the problem is the social world, social norms will say, nope, time to switch. Time to do something else. Or you can't do that. You have to learn this subject instead. Great. It's fantastic. The autistic phenotype can stay on task and learn, build models, build databases for certain things. And that's why things like the visual thinking is also accelerating this and being able to keep this loop open. And then iterative learning is happening. And then that basal ganglia. And then a lot of repetition comes through the basal ganglia. Once things are perfected, they are sent to sensory motor areas and the basal ganglia, and it will become automated. This is a big thing for the autistic phenotype. That's why autism in intuition is more about being able to see things that others cannot. That's a big thing. Lastly, before we wrap up this little whiteboard episode and rant for sure, is remember the definition of autism is autos, which means self. The biology that gives us autism here allows us to be comfortable within ourselves. And this is huge for learning. The biology that gives us autism allows us to be comfortable within ourselves. And this is huge for learning. Because, in other words, people that can't stay on this task stay in this loop because there's a lot of friction that's going to happen here. Because people can't figure something out, they'll bail on it. And this is a big problem. I think this is a big problem, especially in my life and experience, but I'm not going to go there. What I want to kind of convey is the autistic phenotype's learning capacity is brilliant. But the problem is social norms. People limiting them. I don't like it. Remember, autism means autos, which means self. The ability to go inward. The ability to go deep inside. Be comfortable with yourself. Autism and intuition.